This submitted news script examines the escalating, extreme rhetoric used by protest leaders and politicians against the current Israeli government ahead of upcoming elections.
And right off the bat, relying on the raw power of the quotes rather than heavy editorial framing will make the segment's argument significantly more persuasive.
Right.
Because, the author of this piece has done an exceptional job of curation. They've managed to isolate the exact moments where the political temperature just hits an absolute boiling.
Yeah, they really have.
They captured these highly provocative, undeniable sound bites. But having that potent, raw material, it's only half the battle. How you package that heat completely alters how an audience is going to actually receive it.
Totally. And the argument here seems to be that the anchor is just doing entirely too much of the heavy lifting. The script insists on telling the audience exactly what to think before they even encounter the evidence.
Yes.
Like we see this highly charged editorial phrasing deployed right out of the gate. The copy calls the rhetoric wild incitement, or it boldly states that the movement plays on the fears of entire populations.
Which is it's a fundamental weakness in the drafting. When you preload a clip with heavy subjective adjectives like that, you don't amplify the moment, you inadvertently trigger the viewer's skepticism.
Right, because nobody likes being told what to think.
Exactly. We are operating in an era of intense media polarization. So the second an audience senses they're being instructed on how to feel, psychological reactance kicks in. You risk alienating viewers who might otherwise completely agree with your underlying premise simply because they resent being spoon-fed the conclusion.
So the suggestion, then, is to adopt a much more clinical, objective journalistic tone for the anchor's copy. You want to allow the extreme nature of the featured quotes to speak entirely for themselves.
Yeah, and I'd honestly take it a step further. It's not just about getting out of the way, right? It's about actively leveraging contrast.
Contrast, right.
The contrast between a calm, neutral, almost surgical delivery from the news desk and the explosive, fiery rhetoric in the sound bites, that will organically amplify the shock value of the footage. Think about it in terms of audio engineering.
Oh, like dynamic range?
Precisely. If you want a massive, explosive chorus to hit the listener right in the chest, you don't push all the volume faders to the maximum.
Because if everything is loud, nothing is loud.
Exactly. It just becomes a wall of distortion. Instead, you pull the verses back into a whisper. The impact doesn't come from sheer volume, it comes from the space and the silence that precedes the noise.
That makes so much sense. So practically applied to the page, we need to strip out the guiding preambles.
Right.
Instead of introducing a segment by summarizing that politicians are making comparisons to the worst enemies of the Jewish people, the anchor should introduce the clip with a simple factual setup.
Yes, exactly.
The script could just read like, former Defense Minister Bogi Yalan recently addressed protesters with the following historical analogy. And then you simply roll the tape of him invoking Mein Kampf and Nazi racial theory.
And the difference in impact is admiring. By removing the emotionally loaded preamble, the quote hits the viewer with unimpeded force. They experience the gravity of the words directly, rather than through an editorial filter.
I hear the logic, totally, but let me push back on this approach for a second.
Sure.
Is there a risk that by stripping away that urgent warning tone from the anchor, the broadcast might accidentally normalize this extreme rhetoric? Like, if the anchor isn't explicitly condemning the comparison of a sitting Israeli finance minister to Hitler, might the audience assume the network thinks it's just standard, acceptable political discourse?
That is a very, very common fear in news. There's this underlying anxiety that neutrality somehow equals complicity.
Right.
But an objective framing actually exposes the absurdity of the rhetoric much more effectively than moralizing ever. If the anchor is shouting, "Look how crazy and dangerous this is," the broadcast just becomes another partisan shouting match. The anchor just joins the noise floor.
They become part of the very chaos they're trying to critique.
Exactly. But if the anchor calmly states, "Here is what was said," the sheer extremity of invoking Nazi racial theory in a modern domestic political dispute stands starkly isolated.
Wow, yeah.
It refuses to give the rhetoric the cover of a two-sided battle. The clinical tone essentially hands the speaker a microphone, places them in an empty room, and lets their words just echo. The extremity becomes undeniably clear because there is no editorializing to distract from it.
Letting the quotes stand on their own merits naturally leads to the question of how those individual moments are sequenced to build a compelling overarching narrative.
Yes, it really does.
Reordering the sound bites to create a clear, escalating hierarchy of severity will build a more gripping and logical narrative arc for the viewer.
Yeah, because the current flow of the script is, it's deeply problematic. It jumps randomly between different themes and emotional registers. It completely diffuses the built-in tension of the raw material.
It feels entirely scattershot, honestly. Like the script starts with high-stakes political strategy, showing protest leader Aaron Dror calling the prime minister a Hamas funder.
Right.
Then without any real structural warning, it jumps to extreme historical comparisons with Jalal referencing Hitler. After hitting that absolute peak, it shifts sideways to societal and demographic fears, discussing the tension over Haredi versus secular tax burdens and military service.
Yeah.
And finally, it ends on a much quieter, almost academic note with Professor Theodore's empty versus full wagon speech.
Which is just, that sequencing is a recipe for emotional whiplash. You are taking the viewer from an 11 out of 10 down to a 5, up to a 9, and then ending on a 4.
Right.
It's a random list of grievances. And a list is not a persuasive argument. When you subject an audience to that kind of structural chaos, narrative fatigue sets in very quickly.
So the writer needs to organize the clips so they clearly escalate. We have to guide the viewer systematically from the philosophical to the personal, and finally climax with the politically explosive.
You have to earn the loudest moments by establishing the foundation first. Let's map out how this structural escalation should actually look.
Okay, so we would need to start with the baseline of the intellectual divide. That means opening with Professor Itamar Theodore's speech.
Right. He claims his side is the light and the full wagon, while the opposing side is the empty wagon. It's purely philosophical, which makes it the perfect starting point. It establishes an ideological superiority complex. It's delivered relatively calmly, but it exposes the deep-seated mindset driving the entire protest movement.
You're setting the table.
Exactly. You are giving the viewer the intellectual context before showing them the physical reality.
And from there, you transition to how this philosophical divide breeds practical, everyday societal paranoia.
Yes.
You move to the clips about the secular population paying taxes and fighting endless wars, terrified of an impending orthodox halachic state.
Notice what happens to the viewer's psychological journey there. You've moved them from abstract philosophy to tangible, deeply personal fear. The stakes are getting higher.
Yeah, for sure.
The conflict is no longer just about who has the better ideas. It's about who is paying the bills and who is bleeding on the battlefield.
Which perfectly sets up the climax. The final beats must be the most extreme manifestations of this societal fear. We end with Aaron Dror demanding all energy be focused on the enemy prime minister, and Yalan's ultimate comparison of the finance minister's ideology to Mein Kampf.
And then the escalation finally makes logical sense. This is how they think. This is what they personally fear for their families. And finally, this is the volatile, historically loaded rhetoric that such terror inevitably produces. You've built a staircase instead of a maze.
A staircase instead of a maze. I love that. I see how that creates a stronger emotional crescendo, but is there a danger here?
Like what?
Well, reorganizing by theme rather than timeline might misrepresent the chronological escalation of the actual protests. Like, if Professor Theodore's speech actually occurred after Yalan's comments in real life, aren't we manipulating the timeline of how things unfolded on the ground?
Uh-huh.
Doesn't that border on journalistic malpractice?
That's a fair challenge. But we really have to distinguish between a historical diary and thematic news packaging.
Okay.
Could the evidence support the idea that narrative cohesion is more truthful to the viewer's understanding of the phenomenon than a strict timeline? In a piece of analytical journalism like this, dramatic cohesion serves the viewer far better than chronological chaos.
I see.
The goal of this specific segment isn't to provide a minute-by-minute ledger of the protests. The goal is to analyze the nature and the evolution of the rhetoric itself. Sequencing it by intensity allows the audience to grasp the anatomy of a political mindset.
Once the narrative correctly climaxes with these explosive historical comparisons, the sheer extremity of the rhetoric demands a brief look at the political context that triggered it to ensure the reporting remains bulletproof.
Absolutely. Grounding the extreme rhetoric in a brief acknowledgement of the surrounding political context will immunize the report against accusations of cherry-picking.
Because the glaring weakness in the current draft is that it presents these intense quotes entirely in a vacuum.
Right. It focuses solely on the protesters' rhetoric without referencing any of the government actions or statements that precipitated them.
Yeah, like Boogie Yalalan is reacting to very specific things said by the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. but the script leaves Smotra's initial comments out completely.
And that narrowness is a fatal flaw in political reporting. It leaves the piece highly vulnerable. Critics, political operatives, and even just savvy viewers will immediately recognize the omission.
Oh, totally. They'll be all over it on social media.
Yes, they will go to social media, point out the missing context, and successfully dismiss the entire broadcast as a one-sided hit piece that willfully ignores the other half of the political equation. When you omit the catalyst, you destroy the credibility of the critique.
So the suggestion is to briefly include the specific catalyst the speakers are reacting to. Now, to be clear, the goal isn't to justify or excuse the extreme rhetoric of the protest leaders.
No, not at all.
The goal is to establish the anchor's credibility by proving they have the full picture, while still demonstrating that the protest leaders' reactions are disproportionately extreme.
Exactly. We need to immunize the script. When covering Yalon's comparison of the finance minister to Hitler, the anchor must briefly note what Smotry actually said that prompted the outburst.
Right.
The script should read something like, reacting to the finance minister's claim that integrating Mansour Abbas into a coalition is worse than the events of October 7th, Yalon bypassed standard political critique and went straight to invoking Nazi racial theory.
It's basically a matter of intellectual honesty. Consider an analogy. Imagine showing someone a viral video of a person screaming at the top of their lungs in the middle of a crowded coffee shop.
Okay.
Even if the screaming is way too loud and totally out of proportion for a stepped-on toe, hiding the toe stepping makes the video look manipulated.
Yes.
The viewer doesn't just reconsider the screaming man. They actively turn against the person who showed them the cropped video. They feel tricked.
That is a perfect way to look at it. Exposing the toe stepping actually makes the critique of the screaming significantly more impactful. If you hide the catalyst, the viewer feels manipulated. But if you say, yes, his toe was stepped on, it was an undeniable provocation, but look at how wildly disproportionate and dangerous his screaming is in response, you maintain total journalistic authority.
You're proving your objective.
You are telegraphing to the viewer, we see all the pieces on the board, we acknowledge the complexities, and this rhetoric has still crossed a line.
And then the critique becomes unassailable because you've preemptively removed the easiest, most obvious counterargument.
You've blocked the egg.
Yes, but it requires confidence in the material. Writers often strip out context because they're afraid that acknowledging the other side's provocation will weaken their own point. But the opposite is true.
Right.
Context acts as a reinforcing steel within the argument. It proves that the rhetoric is indefensible even when all the mitigating factors are considered. So it all circles back to a central philosophy of restraint and strategic framing. We are pulling back our own editorializing to let the quotes hit harder. We are structuring the chaos into a readable, logical escalation, and we are acknowledging the broader reality so our specific critique cannot be dismissed.
And the core material submitted here is deeply compelling. I mean, the raw elements are fantastic. It just needs the surrounding narrative architecture to be equally robust so that the audience can actually digest the severity of what is being shown to them.
Absolutely. Well, let's recap the main points of our critique today and summarize the actionable suggestions for the author to implement in their next draft. First, adopt a show, don't tell clinical tone. Strip away heavily loaded, subjective adjectives and let the extreme nature of the quotes do the heavy lifting. The contrast between a neutral delivery and explosive sound bites maximizes their impact and bypasses audience reactance.
Second, restructure the segments to create an escalating hierarchy of tension. Move the viewer linearly from philosophical divisions to personal societal fears, and finally climax with the politically explosive historical comparisons. Avoid narrative fatigue by building a clear psychological staircase.
Right. And finally, briefly contextualize the catalysts of the rhetoric. Grounding the extreme quotes in the reality of the political provocations builds unassailable journalistic credibility and immunizes the segment against accusations of bad faith cherry-picking.
Because it is fundamentally about giving the audience the tools to see the truth rather than trying to force a prepackaged conclusion upon them.
We want to thank the listener for submitting this deeply interesting and highly topical political script. We warmly invite you to submit your revised draft, or really any future broadcasts, back to the critique desk for further analysis.
Yeah, we are always eager to see how these complex pieces evolve and sharpen when these structural frameworks are applied.
Because when you want a moment to hit with absolute, undeniable force, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do as a storyteller is to simply step back, lower the volume of your own commentary, and let the distortion speak entirely for itself.